Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Mariancho, and these are my running back rankings for Week 7. This channel is intended for half PPR, and before we get going, we're going to talk about the unranked options. Players on IR include Austin Eckler, Najee Harris, James Conner, Braylon Allen out for a while, Omarion Hampton at least another 3 weeks, and then I have no idea when Joe Mixon is coming back. There is no update. I don't think he's coming back. At this point, I have no idea what's his situation. But Aaron Jones, probably out for at least another week or two. Trey Benson, same situation for him. And then Bucky Irving, as of the moment, is doubtful for Monday night, not ranking Bucky this week. And then Chuba Hubbard is up in the air. He did practice in limited capacity on Wednesday, but is questionable. And they're playing the Jets. So if he's not 100%, if he doesn't need to push it, I feel like they can trust Rico Dowdle enough not to force Chuba. So maybe on Saturday with the injury updates, I'll be changing my opinion and ranking Chuba Hubbard. But as of today, as of Wednesday, I am not ranking Chuba in this video. James Cook and Ray Davis of the Bills are also on bye. So are Derrick Henry and Justice Hill of the Ravens. All of those players are unranked. And let's get into the matchups for Week 7. I'm not going to belabor this chart too much today because now that we're going into Week 7, 6 weeks is a good sample size, but also the first couple games are not that safe to trust on season-long trends. So some of these stats are very much in flux, and some teams that were way lower on this chart are pulling up the board and vice versa. Like the Chargers and Chiefs, a few weeks ago, were on opposite spectrums. The Chargers were much tougher a few weeks ago. The Chiefs have gotten much more difficult. So next week I'll be isolating in shorter time frames, just like the last 4 games or so. But in this matchup, I'll keep the season-long averages for the sake of the chart. So let's run through them. Let's tell you which are the best, which are the worst. And at the top, we do have the Bengals that give up 29 points per game. They play Jaylen Warren and Kenny Gainwell on Thursday night. Off the bye, Gainwell's a bit more involved, but I would trust Jaylen Warren against Cincinnati. The Ravens are a very bad defense this year. They are on bye. The number 2 matchup is irrelevant this week. And number 3 sadly feels a bit wasted on the Patriots. The Titans are giving up 26 points per game, over 140 yards per game. But to tell me you know that Rhamondre should be in the lineup regardless of all of his concerns, I don't feel good about that. At some point, the TreVeyon Henderson breakout game will happen against Tennessee. I'm hopeful, but damn, I really wish we had more clarity in New England. Sadly, the Titans matchup is an upgrade, but kind of feels sort of wasted on New England. The 4th best matchup looked a lot more difficult last week against Washington after the bye. So although Alvin Kamara and Kendre Miller on paper get an upgrade, I'm not fully convinced. I think this is a team that will be moving down the list as the weeks go by. Last year, Chicago was actually really tough against the run. This year, they've been top 5, but last week they did shut down JCM. Speaking of JCM, he also gets an upgrade against Dallas, which I do believe is very legit. So despite a rough game last week, the volume went up. I think I would still trust Jacory Crosley-Merritt in the lineup. The 6th best matchup is Buffalo, who are also on bye, so that's not helpful. But number 7, shocker, is Philadelphia. They've been really bad at stopping the run. And the injury to Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith are really not helping them on the defensive line. They've been pretty vulnerable. They just gave up 30 points to Cam Skattebo. So maybe you're going to trust Jordan Mason and Zavier Scott a lot more this week. I do think Mason has some legitimate starting value against Philly. In Miami, that's also been a terrible defense this year. They give up 180 yards from scrimmage to opposing running backs every week. That is by far the most in the league. And even though they don't give up that many touchdowns, they are looking like a truly elite matchup. Kimani Vidal just torched them. So they face off against Quinshon Judkins and Jerome Ford. I would definitely be starting Quinshon, especially given this matchup has heavy rain and wind expected. The weather will be a factor. They'll lean on the run in Cleveland. Start Quinshon in this matchup. San Francisco has also been pretty bad on defense. They're just reeling with injuries. So Fred Warner's now gone. Nick Bosa's gone. I would 100% be starting Bijan Robinson and also consider upgrading Tyler Algier, a good matchup for Algier as well. The last one giving up over 21 points per game, the final upgrade, is Arizona. They're good at stopping receivers, but not running backs. Josh Jacobs was already in your lineup. Expect good production from Jacobs. He gets an upgrade. I will mention 3 or 4 other matchups, though. The Vikings are facing off against Saquon, and they do give up 141 scrimmage yards per game. They're middle of the pack, but in terms of yardage, I think Saquon will be a little extra efficient this week. He's been bad in that department. The Commanders also give up a lot of yardage, 137 scrimmage yards per game, so Javonte Williams will have a very safe floor this week. Look for a bounce back for Javonte against the Commanders. I also like the touchdown odds for Carolina. They face off against the Jets, who have given up 6 total touchdowns to running backs this year, so the odds for a touchdown on Rico Dowdle seem pretty high. Unless Chuba plays, I still think a touchdown is available for Carolina's backfield. The Texans have also given up touchdowns as well, an average of 1 per game. So Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet splitting touches, it's probably going to be there for Charbonnet this week. And lastly, I mentioned the Chargers have been moving up the chart significantly. If you only look at the last 2 games, the Chargers actually are the best matchup possible. They have given up 176 yards from scrimmage to running backs the last couple games. That would rank just behind Miami as the second most in the league. And then they also have 2 running back touchdowns scored on them in each of the last 2 games, 4 total in the last 2 games. The Chargers are allowing 34.1 points per game over the last 2 games against running backs. They get Jonathan Taylor this week. Maybe Taylor actually has the best matchup you could ask for. On the opposite side of the chart, the big downgrades would be Cleveland. The Browns are elite at stopping running backs. They get DeVon Achane this week, so maybe that doesn't matter. You're still going to be starting DeVon Achane, but a tough game against Cleveland for him. And then the Packers are also really good at stopping running backs, only 14.7 points per game. Bam Knight and Michael Carter splitting the backfield. I don't think I want to be starting an Arizona running back in this game. The Falcons have been great at stopping running backs, but they get the Niners this week, so you're still starting McCaffrey, but lowering his projection. The Rams have been elite at stopping running backs, only 1 touchdown allowed on the season. Travis Etienne and Baishal Tutin deserve a big downgrade. It's very difficult to score a touchdown on the Rams. Denver has also been great across the board on defense, so Cam Skattebo gets a downgrade, but he looks so good against the Eagles, I kind of don't care. The Lions have also been really good at stopping running backs as well, but mainly in terms of yardage. They're only giving up 97 total yards per game, but that gap between 9.7 and 16.1 suggests touchdowns are available for running backs on Detroit. Rachaad White is still in my lineup, assuming Bucky remains doubtful. Jacksonville has also been good on defense, so Kyren Williams and Blake Corum going to have a tougher spot this week in London, but without Puka, I'm still going to trust Kyren, much higher odds at a touchdown without Puka for the Rams. In New England, that's also been a good run defense this year, so Tony Pollard and Tyjae Spears starting to look like a 50-50 split now. Not going to start them with confidence. The Colts have also been a big downgrade, bottom 10 matchup for Kimani Vidal. Last week against Miami was way, way easier than this week against the Colts. I'm a little worried about fully trusting Kimani against the Colts. The Panthers have also had a good defense. Last week, they shut down Javonte Williams, and they are really turning a corner. Previously, the last 3 years, Carolina was the best matchup overall, and then this season, they do rank bottom 10. Breece Hall is unlikely to pop off for his first touchdown of the year against Carolina. I also want to mention a few other teams. The Texans, I mentioned, give up a touchdown per game, but in terms of yardage, are tough to run against. Only 98 yards per game allowed by Houston. So without a touchdown, I don't feel confident in the Seahawks backfield this week. Just flex plays in my view. And then the Raiders have given up a lot of touchdowns, but the Colts game kind of skews it. Overall, you're getting less than 100 yards from scrimmage from running backs against Las Vegas. So maybe you believe in the Chiefs blowing them out, but Pacheco and Kareem Hunt are big liabilities this week in terms of overall yardage. And then in terms of touchdown odds, they are less than 50% this season regarding the Steelers defense. Only 3 touchdowns in 5 games allowed this year. So Chase Brown, very unlikely to score a touchdown. The Vikings are also limiting touchdowns to about 50%. Saquon is not a guarantee to find pay dirt. And then the Dolphins, even though they give up a ton of yards, have only allowed 3 touchdowns in 6 games this year, 50% odds at a touchdown for Cleveland. So Quinshon might be very effective at running the ball, but maybe doesn't find the end zone. And then lastly, I brought it up earlier, the Chiefs have been rapidly moving down the chart, and over the last 2 games specifically would be the toughest matchup you could find. Last 2 games, only 97 total yards per game allowed to running backs, and not a single touchdown. 11.5 points per game is the average for Kansas City over the last 2 weeks. And matchups are not the reason why. They faced off against Jacksonville and Detroit. Those 2 teams have been really bad against the Kansas City run defense, and they're pretty good in terms of personnel. I'd be very worried about Ashton Genty this week against Kansas City. I would expect them to lock him up. So those are all of the matchups, all of the breakdowns this week. Now let's get to the full rankings. We're at the top. It's pretty clear. Jonathan Taylor, Bijan Robinson are 1 and 2, and I have Josh Jacobs at number 3 in this tier. All players get a massive upgrade, but if we look at the last 2 games, the best matchup overall would be the Chargers. They cannot stop the run, and it makes sense. They have 8 players on defense on IR at the moment, and I really don't trust their defensive line or linebackers to stop Taylor. Fuck no, they barely had a chance against DeVon Achane. So in terms of points per game, Bijan and Taylor are 1 and 2. Bijan at 22.4. Taylor at 22.2, and I prefer the matchup just slightly for Taylor. I think he's going to crush. I'll be in attendance, and just like JCM, I'm expecting 2 touchdowns from Taylor and over 100 yards on the Chargers. He's going to demolish them. I think he's the best running back in fantasy week 7. At number 2, though, Bijan is right there behind him. He had an elite game on Monday night against Buffalo, and he also gets a top 10 matchup against San Francisco. But I think the Chargers matchup is actually easier than the Niners matchup despite their injuries. But with no Fred Warner, it's like truly on their last legs. The Niners are so depleted. They're also very injured. I trust Bijan no matter what. But why I have Josh Jacobs at number 3, the Arizona matchup also ranks top 10. And in the last 2 games, Josh Jacobs does have back-to-back 2 touchdown performances, 4 touchdowns over his last 2 games. So love Jacobs. He is phenomenal, and I think he's a lock to find the end zone. Very safe play against Arizona, who do have a good secondary. I trust Jacobs on the road to put up at least 100 yards and a touchdown. He is a lock in the lineup, but I do think he's going to be better than Christian McCaffrey and DeVon Achane this week. I have them below the tier break, and the matchups are terrible for these 2 players. Let's start with McCaffrey, who gets Atlanta, and despite 17 rush attempts, James Cook didn't have a good fantasy game against the Falcons. They have a very legit defense. They focused a lot on that during the draft, and off the bye, I think they're going to be even better. That is an advantage. I think recently off the bye week, those teams usually play a little better. So I really worry about this Falcons matchup, but not enough to bench Christian McCaffrey. Obviously, he's unlocking the lineup, but I'm dropping him down a tier because I am respecting the Falcons defense. They are only giving up less than 15 points per game to opposing running back cores. And some of those points will go to Kyle Juszczyk. A couple might go to Brian Robinson. 80% of the touches are going to McCaffrey, but if not for his passing game role, I don't think he'd have the highest ceiling. But he's so elite, you can't bench him. Definitely still in the top 5, but below the purple line in week 7. At number 5, I'm also going to keep Achane below the purple line, but he's looking matchup proof, really an elite player, and all of the Ollie Gordon concerns have quickly evaporated. There is really no competition in this backfield. So Achane looks phenomenal. The Cleveland matchup is the worst you could find, so even more difficult than the Falcons, but I'm still going to start DeVon Achane. There's heavy wind in this game, over 20 miles per hour gusts, along with plenty of rain. I do not trust Tua to move the ball. So they're going to keep it out of his hands. They're going to give it to their best playmaker. Achane is the most valuable Dolphin, and I cannot bench him against Cleveland. Even though I want to rank him much lower, I just can't. Last week was really an indictment on anyone who was doubting him. And I did have some doubts earlier in the year. The volume was a bit concerning. First few games, it has picked up. He's looked great. Without Tyreek Hill, I know the targets are also incoming. Start Achane despite a massive downgrade in terms of matchups. He's still in my top 5. I would still start him over Jahmyr Gibbs versus Tampa Bay. Gibbs technically has a better than average matchup. The Bucs actually rank 13th across the league. But if you look closer, they're actually elite at stopping the run. They give up a lot of receiving yards. That's really the only value you can find when you go up against Tampa Bay. So Gibbs does catch passes. That'll definitely pad his numbers, but we have seen Montgomery factor in much more. And then last week against Kansas City, the Lions didn't have a good offense overall. Gibbs didn't find the end zone. He had less than 10 points. So it's unfortunate. We know he has elite upside, but if you really look at last year, it didn't quite materialize until Montgomery got injured. Before Montgomery went down, Gibbs was like RB8 on the season. Very consistently high floor every week, but not always cracking 20 points. And then once Montgomery went down, he averaged almost 30 points. So it is a little sad to see, given where you drafted Gibbs, to know that Achane and Jacobs are going to have more value this week. Even Taylor was being drafted almost 2 rounds later than Gibbs. It's a bit unfortunate, but he's still in the top 6. I'm not telling you to bench him. He's just below McCaffrey and Achane, who have been much more productive on the season. Gibbs, I do not feel is matchup proof because of Montgomery eating into the volume. At number 7, I have Rico Dowdle at the Jets, who's looking like a league winner right now, but there is a chance that Chuba Hubbard will come back. At the moment, I'm still not ranking Chuba Hubbard. So assuming Dowdle has this backfield all to himself for the 3rd week in a row, he will be amazing. It's the Jets defense. I'm not worried, even though they did look good in London against the Broncos. But maybe that is more of a legit concern than I expect it to be. We expected their defensive personnel to be good entering the year, and then they just shit the bed in September. So perhaps things will turn around for New York, but if Dowdle is not splitting the backfield, I think he's a must start. Averaging over 30 points the last 2 games, why the fuck would you bench him? So gotta rank him as a must start. On Saturday, when we have more clarity on Chuba Hubbard's status, maybe I'll be dropping him because of the touch split, but for now, I'll assume he's the workhorse. I don't think they need Chuba Hubbard to beat the Jets. If he's not fully recovered, I don't think they'll force him back on the field. So that's where I'm willing to trust Rico in the top 10. But if Chuba Hubbard does start, I'll probably drop him down closer to like RB 16 or 17. I think I'd still rather go Dowdle over Chuba in week 7. I think off the injury, Chuba's not going to dominate the workload at an elite rate. Dowdle has earned a lot more volume rest of season. At number 8, I have Saquon Barkley at the Vikings, and off some extra rest given the Thursday night game, I do expect the Eagles offense to get back to their identity. They need to run the ball as much as possible. When they do that, more than throw it, they usually win, and they've lost 2 in a row. They need to fix things that are not working. So this Vikings matchup is actually elite at stopping the pass. If they know what's best for them, they will not be throwing it very much. And that's where I do trust Saquon from a yards standpoint. The Vikings do allow 141 yards from scrimmage to the position every week. So they have limited touchdowns, but I still think Saquon will find the end zone. He didn't score last week, but whenever he does, he has been good for 16 or 17 points. I'm expecting that to be the case for Saquon this week. I would start him. I think he's still a top 10 running back. But in bad matchups, I'd be fading him. This one is not a bad matchup. But off the bye, perhaps they do improve. Last year, they were great on defense. Maybe off the bye, they get back to that. But before the bye, they were pretty average at stopping the run. At number 9, I got Javonte Williams versus Washington. I know last week was not a great game, but I'm not going to overreact to just one bad performance. The volume is what I need to see from Javonte in order to keep trusting him. It did not go away from him. He had 8 targets as well. And assuming this Commanders game is as competitive as I'm expecting, they're going to need to score like crazy. So with the return of CeeDee Lamb, I do think the boxes will be less stacked. They have to defend the pass even more. And I do think Javonte will continue to dominate the workload. Miles Sanders still not fully healthy. Jaden Blue really irrelevant. And the volume is pretty much locked in for Javonte. He's getting at least 80% of the workload every week at minimum. So I trust him. I know there's going to be some bad games here or there. He's not as talented as Jahmyr Gibbs. So if the opposing defense can step up, then you will get limited at times. But he's been so effective, and the Cowboys offense is just humming I will expect touchdowns to come back to him. So Javonte remains in my top 10. The matchup is not a major concern. And I think this game is a massive shootout. I want every piece of it I can get. Start Javonte. He's still a top 10 running back. At number 10, I think we are dropping down a tier because of matchups most of the time. But Kyren Williams still needs to remain in your lineup. With no Puka Nacua, the target distribution is up in the air. That's like 12, 13 targets that can go elsewhere. So some of them will go to Kyren, and especially on the goal line, he's even more of a go-to target. I expect a very high floor from Kyren Williams. The matchup is not good. The Jags rank as a bottom 6 defense to go up against, so not ideal. I'm not going to upgrade him, but because of the Puka situation, there's no way I'm not ranking him in the top 12. So versus Jacksonville, on paper it's tough, but I kind of don't care. Kyren's getting enough volume, and given the Blake Corum fumble a couple weeks ago, I'm not going to worry about Corum earlier than the bye week. Maybe he'll get back into the mix, but right now Corum is not a big factor in terms of vulture potential. So trusting Kyren Williams, if he scores multiple touchdowns, wouldn't be shocked. The Jags have a good defense, but Kyren is talented enough to exploit it. I'm going to trust Sean McVay and the Rams offense. With no Puka, you have to start Kyren, but he's not above the blue line because the matchup is difficult on paper. At number 11, same situation for Rachaad White. The matchup is very difficult on paper. The Lions give up less than 100 yards from scrimmage every week. So Rachaad White may not be very effective from a yards per carry standpoint. But over the last 2 games with no Bucky Irving, he has 3 touchdowns. And although Sean Tucker had one as well, Rachaad is not going anywhere. He's still the number 1 guy in this backfield. And Bucky Irving, as of this recording, is doubtful for Monday night, so not going to change my opinion on Rachaad. As long as Bucky is out, you have to start him. Even in a bad matchup, I'm going to bet on Baker Mayfield and the Bucs offense. With Egbuka going down and Mike Evans not a lock to return, Rachaad can catch even more receptions, and then when they get in the red zone, he's even more likely to get the ball yet again. So love Rachaad. The floor is very safe, very much locked into the lineup because Bucky is inactive. At least that's what I'm expecting. Bucky not going to play. At number 12, we have Quinshon Judkins versus Miami. And I know last week was very discouraging. I missed pretty hard on Quinshon last week, but up until that point, he was averaging over 100 yards from scrimmage per game. 14.4 points, was tied with Saquon entering week 6. And I'm still going to trust that he is talented enough to bet on. This matchup against the Dolphins is elite. They give up the most yards from scrimmage to any opposing running back core that you can find. Last week, Kimani Vidal had well over 100 yards and a touchdown. If Kimani can do that, Quinshon, a second-round pick, can fucking torch them even more. So I will be starting Quinshon. I'm going back to the well. I'm not going to overreact to just one bad game. It's just like Javonte Williams. Sometimes there's bumps in the road, but you didn't draft them expecting elite production. They've really overperformed your expectation. And for you to have them on your roster, you got to be grateful for it and just keep trusting them because they are in great situations. I think Quinshon will be a workhorse yet again. He is splitting the backfield with Jerome Ford, especially in the passing game. I wish he was getting more targets, but he's not disappearing in that regard. And when the game script is relatively even with their opponent, they are not going to go away from Quinshon Judkins unless it's the 2-minute drill and they need to score quickly. So I'm trusting the workload. I'm trusting the matchup. I'm expecting close to 130 yards, honestly, from Quinshon Judkins. I think he will go over not just 100, but like 120 from scrimmage. There is bad weather in this game. Dylan Gabriel is not going to be throwing it 50 plus times. Give me Quinshon Judkins as a top 12 play. I think he's a must start in week 7. The touchdown may not hit. The Dolphins are actually good at stopping that, but the yardage will be there. At number 13, I have DeAndre Swift versus New Orleans, and off the bye, it looked like Ben Johnson wanted to establish the run a decent amount. So while Kyle Monangai got a little more involved, he is nowhere near a threat to Swift's workload, and with his efficiency and pass catching ability paired with the Bears play calling, I trust him to be involved on a weekly basis and keep the floor very high in fantasy. I think a touchdown is actually the safest bet to go to Swift in Chicago. It's kind of crowded in the passing game, but in the backfield, it is not a question at all. It is Swift's role, and there's not much competition overall. He's probably getting 80% of the volume yet again. At least 75 is a very safe bet. So give me DeAndre Swift as a top 15 play. The Saints are not a scary matchup at all. He's going to consistently be a high-end RB2. At worst, a top 20 play rest of season. He's looking like a very safe option in the Bears' good offense. At number 14, I have Cam Skattebo at Denver, and I have to downgrade him because the Broncos are such an ugly matchup. It's still early in Skattebo's career, and we haven't seen like week in, week out matchup-proof production to where I'm not worried about a big downgrade like this. So Denver can definitely limit this offense. It could look just as bad as the London game for the Jets, where the quarterback can't do anything and even the running backs are struggling. So this could be an overreaction. Skattebo looks like a top 10 running back rest of season. And with Tyrone Tracy, an afterthought last week, there's really no concern about the touch split. It is Skattebo's job overwhelmingly. He looks like the heart of their offense, so I do not want to bench him. I have to downgrade him because I'm respecting Denver, but at 14, I'm dropping him down like 7 spots lower than I want to. I kind of want to put him above Saquon Barkley, around Rico Dowdle and Jahmyr Gibbs. I really think he could be that valuable if the role continues. And it looks like a concussion is a big concern long term, but as long as he's healthy, I got to keep starting him. Skattebo's just too fun to root for. So put him in the lineup at number 14. I think odds are you don't have enough good depth to be benching Cam Skattebo despite the Broncos' tough matchup. At 15, I think we're dropping down a slight tier, but I'm still definitely starting all of these players. These are my top 20 options, and in the lineup, they're most likely going to be a flex play at worst. I doubt you have enough depth overall where you are forced to bench him. But some of you play in shallow leagues, maybe that's the case. In a regular league, I think you are going to be starting guys like JCM and Jaylen Warren. JCM gets the Cowboys this week. That's a very good matchup. It ranks number 5 on the week, and some of the best matchups are kind of wasted in weird backfields. So I'm definitely going to trust JCM despite a rough game against the Bears. I was encouraged with the volume he saw. It has been increasing steadily since Eckler has gone down. Last week he had 17 rush attempts, 1 reception, and 18 touches. Does mark a season high. So that is very encouraging. This game is likely a massive shootout against Dallas. Obviously, last week was a little discouraging, only 3.6 yards per carry. After the previous 2 games, he was averaging 7.1 yards per carry. But odds are it evens out, and he's closer to 5 yards per carry this week. The Cowboys do not scare you at all in any facet on defense. So I'm going to trust Jaden Daniels. I'm going to trust the Commanders' offense. And even if Terry McLaurin comes back, that's just going to keep the offense on the field and lead to more scoring opportunities, fewer field goals, and more first downs. Give me JCM as a top 15 option for the second week in a row. I did miss last week, but the volume was encouraging enough where I will trust him. In a great matchup, I'm going to be starting JCM, but in bad matchups, he'll be ranked closer to RB25. This week, though, at 15, I'd keep him in the lineup. At 16, I have Jaylen Warren at the Bengals, who gets the best matchup on paper. The Bengals have been atrociously bad at stopping running backs. They've allowed 10 touchdowns to running backs in just 6 games this year. They also give up the 5th most receiving yards to the position as well. So given Gainwell was much more involved in the passing game last week, perhaps Warren doesn't quite exploit it. If not for Kenny Gainwell, I would probably be ranking Jaylen Warren at RB12. I think he might even be more valuable than Quinshon Judkins this week, if not for the committee between him and Gainwell. But he's looked very efficient, had a pretty high floor this season. Even without a touchdown, he's a pretty safe play, and I don't think the volume is going to completely go away from him. The Bengals are just such a good spot for opposing running backs. So given Calvin Austin is injured, they're probably not going to throw it as much this week. I think Jaylen Warren will be a good go-to target for Rodgers in this game, and I also trust the usage on the ground. I think he finds the end zone. The odds are very high that there's not just 1, but 2 touchdowns available for the Steelers running back. So I think Warren is a clear top 20 play. Any running back against Cincinnati deserves a significant boost in confidence. He should be started in most formats. At number 17, I have Jordan Mason versus Philadelphia, and I will acknowledge the game script is kind of important for Mason's success. If it goes away from him, if they are trailing, then I worry about Zavier Scott really factoring in, because Mason does not catch passes at a high rate. If you get more than one reception for Mason, it's kind of a shocker. I kind of feel like the only target they send him is just to keep the defense honest, knowing that that is possible, but that's never how they use him multiple times a game. It's very unlikely. So Mason is kind of game script and touchdown dependent, but the Eagles have been a good matchup so far. They rank top 7 against the position this year, and a lot of injuries have been a factor there. So if Jalen Carter comes back to the lineup, I'll probably be downgrading Mason a bit, but assuming he misses again, I do think Mason deserves a very safe plug into the lineup. I think he has a very high floor in a good matchup. We just saw Cam Skattebo drop 30 points with 3 touchdowns on Philly. So I expect a touchdown for Mason. I think this is a good matchup to chase. And as long as those injured defensive linemen don't get healthy, not just Jalen Carter, but Nolan Smith, who I believe is on IR still, then I'm not going to worry about the Eagles. Last year they were great, but this year their defense nowhere near as tough. They lost a lot of pieces in free agency as well. So I think Mason is a good start this week. We'll monitor the injury report for Jalen Carter, but if he remains out, then I'm definitely starting Mason against the Eagles. I expect at home, the Vikings off a bye, to play well and offer some touchdown production. I could see a big shootout as well. Maybe multiple touchdowns are available for Mason, but without the passing game usage, there is some risk involved. Beyond this point, you could consider them high-end flex plays. They're not like locked into the lineup, just low-end RB2s. And with some teams on bye, maybe you got to trust him. I think they're worth it, though. In this matchup, I would trust Jordan Mason. At 18, I have J.K. Dobbins versus the Giants, who's also a bit game script dependent. If the game gets away from them, they could look to R.J. Harvey in the passing game. But against the Giants, I'm not going to expect that the Broncos defense should really shut down this turnover-prone rookie quarterback. Against the Saints, Dart had 3 turnovers. That game was also on the road. They have a little extra rest, but I do not trust Dart to be as effective against Denver. So assuming they have the lead, Dobbins will continue to churn out clock and run the ball. That is where I'm trusting his floor. The yardage is usually there. Last week it wasn't, though, and we didn't consider the Jets to be a tough matchup, but he only ran for 2.9 yards per carry. That's not encouraging. If it continues, we might see R.J. Harvey's role start to expand. But until he shits the bed entirely, I'll still trust Dobbins to be the main guy. I think until he goes down, he's not going to relinquish his job as the RB1. So I'll keep him in the lineup, but I don't see like elite upside this week. A little touchdown dependent, but I do think it hits. The Giants don't rank as a bad matchup. Up until the last 2 games, they were actually a very good matchup, but they're starting to get better, a bit tougher on defense. So average matchup, neutral spot. I'll keep Dobbins in the top 20, but not going to upgrade him. Not a must start in the top 15. At 19, I think Dave Montgomery is worth a start this week. He is touchdown dependent, just like Dobbins, but I do think this game against Tampa will be a very high scoring game. Usually the Lions play very well when they're playing at home. In the Dome, I do expect a lot of points here. Goff should bounce back, and there's always the potential that Montgomery just doesn't find the end zone. But against the Bucs, they have been kind of vulnerable this season. Even though they're good at stopping the run, they're actually bad at stopping pass catching running backs quite a bit. So interestingly, Montgomery is catching passes. Last week, he had more usage in that department than Jahmyr Gibbs, and the targets are there enough to keep him viable in that department. I am a little worried about Montgomery not finding the end zone. When he doesn't, you kind of get burned. But in this game, I expect 4 touchdowns for the Lions offense overall, and I think one of them has a pretty high chance of going to David. So I would start him as a low-end RB2. I think top 20 is a decent investment this week. There's some bad matchups elsewhere. Against Tampa, it's a little bit more neutral. I'll keep Montgomery in the lineup because of his upside. He has shown you an elite ceiling. When it works out, he has been really good. When it doesn't, you get burned, but I think this week he'll be fine. I think he'll be productive against Tampa. They're going to need him to find the end zone. At 20, the last player I think is in your lineup most likely would be Kimani Vidal versus Indianapolis. And I want to believe that Vidal can do what he did against the Dolphins every week. But odds are that's unrealistic. The Dolphins are a very good matchup. The Colts are not. The Colts rank bottom 10, and Vidal will have a prove-it game in week 7. So perhaps he comes crashing down to earth, but from a usage standpoint, Hassan Haskins was a bit of an afterthought. The touch split favored Kimani 21-7. So if he's getting 75% of the volume, you have to trust that floor. And I do think the touchdown odds are relatively high, especially if Quentin Johnston remains out yet again. So perhaps he comes back. Perhaps Herbert relies on the receivers. It's a much better matchup against the secondary of the Colts than their run defense. So perhaps Vidal looks like shit, but he looked explosive. He had some good bursts last week, and I do think from an athletic standpoint, he is well above Hassan Haskins. So I'll keep him in the lineup from a floor standpoint. I think he's a reliable low-end RB2. Maybe doesn't have the highest upside because the matchup is bottom 10, but I do think from a floor standpoint, 80 or so yards off of his volume is a relatively decent bet. I think the floor is safe, but the upside, a bit capped, given the matchup, is a downgrade. Beyond this point, I'm very worried about some of these matchups or just these players overall. They are the higher end flex plays, but not locks in the lineup. I would kind of prefer benching some of these guys, to be honest with you. I think beyond Jordan Mason and Jaylen Warren, I actually think it's a pretty big risk factor in your lineup most of the time. Some of these names are very hard to trust because some of the best matchups are on bye as well as kind of wasted against some ambiguous backfields. But at number 21, I think the volume for Ashton Jeanty keeps him in the high-end flex territory. This Chiefs matchup, though, has been the toughest the last 2 games. They shut down the Jags, not a touchdown there. And then last week, there wasn't a touchdown available for the Lions running backs either. And although Jeanty is elite, I can't say I'm pretending he's better collectively than the Lions running back duo of Montgomery and Gibbs. Jeanty can still pop off a big touchdown in a division rivalry game. Maybe he plays up to competition. The Raiders usually do when they face the Chiefs. But the Chiefs defense looks much better the last couple games, and I just don't want to trust it. They've only allowed 11.5 points per game to opposing backfields the last 2 games. That would rank as the worst matchup on paper, even more difficult than Cleveland. So I'm not trying to push my luck. I don't think Jeanty has much upside this week. Without a touchdown, you will get screwed. And even last week, in a good matchup, he almost burned you. Without a touchdown, he would have been pretty mediocre and not a safe play, but the touchdown did salvage an otherwise rough game in a good matchup nonetheless. Last week, I thought Jeanty would be way better, and he was fine. He wasn't bad, but he wasn't as good as I expected. This week, I'm worried he looks like shit. So I'll rank him at 21 just off of name value primarily. The volume is safe to bet on, but I hate this matchup. I think the Chiefs are going to be a big avoid rest of season. They're starting to look really good, just like they did last season. So no thanks with Jeanty if I can avoid it, but if you have to, at 21, I get it. He is a flex play in the ranks. At 22, I'm downgrading Travis Etienne significantly as well. Etienne draws the 3rd toughest matchup on the slate. So the Rams have only given up 1 touchdown to the position this year. That would be to Christian McCaffrey. And although Derrick Henry was pretty efficient last week, did go over 100 yards, he also did not find the end zone. So I'm not expecting Etienne to do that. I'm going to trust that the Rams defense continues to be very stout in the red zone, and I'm just not expecting that extra 6 points for Etienne. So he'll have to do it on yardage. He's capable of that. He has averaged 100 yards per game earlier in the season. Like up until week 5, he was a very efficient running back on the ground, but lately he's been a bit less efficient. The Chiefs kind of showed you how to stop him, and I think the Rams will continue to do that. I don't like the upside for Etienne. Similar to Jeanty, I do not think he finds the end zone and covers you. In case of a collapse in efficiency, you might get totally burned with Etienne. There is a lot of risk factoring in to the equation against the Rams. So not ideal high-end flex, but low-end starter. If you can afford to bench him, I would, but at 22, odds are he'll stay in the lineup as a flex play. Not expecting more than 12 points, though, from Etienne in this matchup. I'm also not going to expect that from Breece Hall versus Carolina. Hall has a very capped ceiling, hasn't scored a touchdown this season. And with Garrett Wilson exiting the lineup this week, I think the offense could look even worse than it did against Denver. I have no confidence that Justin Fields keeps moving the chains without his go-to target at receiver. So every play will be the same. The defense knows what the offense is going to do. I would expect a lot of 8-man boxes against the Panthers this week. So I'm not dying to trust Breece Hall. Maybe he has a big play and he can turn it into a house call, but without it, he's never really given you a touchdown, and you need him to go over 100 yards. I just don't see it coming against the Panthers. I think they will really shut down the Jets offense as a whole. So he's talented enough to keep in the flex conversation, but not good enough in fantasy this year where there's any ceiling available. I don't think this is the week to upgrade him as a big lock in the lineup. So no thanks if I can, but at 23, I get it if you're forced to. And at 24, I want to rank Kamara higher. The Bears matchup does rank top 4 on the season. But last week off of the bye, they really shut down Jacory Crosley-Merritt. So I'm more reluctant to believe that this is an upgrade for Kamara. He's still in a touch split with Kendre Miller. And although his role in the passing game is not a question, I just don't see many touchdowns in New Orleans in the first place. And if the Bears are now really good at stopping the run, then Kamara doesn't deserve even this high of a ranking. He's been bad the last few games, very little upside in New Orleans. And a big factor as to why I'm not going to expect a touchdown for Kamara is because Taysom Hill is back in the fold. Taysom Hill has 2 one-yard touchdowns in each of the last 2 games. That is a very annoying factor. We also have to worry about Kendre Miller. So the Saints just don't score enough to feel confident, even though against the Bears it should be a good spot here. I just don't feel it's worth it. I really don't trust Kamara very much. He's 30 years old and injury can happen at any time. And although it sounds like he's unlikely to get traded, it is still possible. Without a trade out of New Orleans, though, I don't see much upside incoming for Kamara rest of the season. So no thanks. If I can avoid it, I will. But perhaps the Chicago stats are legit and last week was a fluke because the Commanders game meant so much to them after they lost on the Hail Mary the year prior. But I think if they play that well on defense, they believe in themselves, they can do it again. I could see Kamara really locked up against Chicago. I will pass if I can, but he is a top 25 option in the rankings. At 25 and 26, I have both of the Seahawks running backs, and this rotation fucking sucks for fantasy purposes. I do have Charbonnet ranked higher this week, though, because against Houston, it is an interesting matchup. They're very good at stopping you on the ground. Only 98 yards per game allowed to opposing backfields against the Texans. So if it's a 50-50 split, as it usually is, then I'm not expecting Walker or Charbonnet to offer you more than like 70 yards on the ground, most likely. And that means they're very touchdown dependent, and I don't feel like it's going to go to Walker. The Texans have allowed 1 touchdown per game this season, 5 in 5 games. And based on trends, that's going to be going to Charbonnet if it's available for the Seahawks running backs. Charbonnet has more touchdowns in fewer games than Walker does. And when Walker did score, it was mainly the weeks when Charbonnet got injured. So I just don't trust that upside for Walker. He's more talented than Charbonnet, but not by enough to keep him at arm's length. The touch split is very close to 50-50. So it's a big headache. It's really annoying. The Texans matchup isn't elite, so not a big significant upgrade for either guy. You are really hoping for a touchdown, and odds are it goes to Charbonnet. But even if it does, you're probably not going to get more than 12 points. He has not done that despite multiple touchdowns this season. So the floor is decent with them. I think you're getting at least 8 points from both guys, but to expect more than 13 is a big gamble. I would not project that for either Seahawks running back. It's just a very annoying rotation. And sadly, the upside is capped. So they're the last flex plays I would consider, but I would rather go Charbonnet than Walker in this game. I think the touchdown is a bit safer to expect for Charbonnet. Moving forward, we're dropping down a tier, and now we're beyond the black line, which is my 10-point projection. I think these guys are most likely going to be benched in your lineup. That is my main recommendation, to be benching all the players moving forward. But at 27 and 28, I really want to tell you that there's a Patriots running back worth starting this week. The Titans matchup is the 3rd best on the season, And this week with Baltimore on bye, they are the second best matchup on the slate. So I want to exploit that. The Titans have given up 10 touchdowns to running backs this season, and odds are one of them will find the end zone this week. But I can't tell you with confidence that even if Rhamondre does do that, you're going to get more than 10 points. He has a game with 2 touchdowns and less than 14 points. That is ass when you really think about 12 of those points are coming off of touchdowns. So he could fumble it multiple times again and cough up the game. I could see a big breakout for TreVeyon. I've been waiting for it, but it hasn't happened, and that's why I just can't bet on it. So I think TreVeyon has the higher upside. If this is indeed his breakout, the matchup is amazing for him, so I'm really hopeful for it. But the only reason I'm going to start him in the subscriber league is because my depth is depleted, and I have Hampton on IR behind Bijan. Henderson is my best guy at running back, but at 28 in the rankings, I feel really bad about it. I'm just hoping for a touchdown, and without it, I will be screwed. So I would still expect Rhamondre to be more likely to get those goal line touches. Without them, you will have nothing, though. But TreVeyon has been way more efficient. For whatever reason, they do not trust Henderson enough to eclipse Rhamondre, and that fucking sucks. I fucking hate it. But maybe this is the week. Maybe it's the TreVeyon breakout finally incoming, but until I see it, I just can't rank him any higher. Sadly, the Titans matchup is a bit wasted, but if you're willing to take a shot, there is a lot of upside here. There is potential you get a 20-plus point game, just like Kimani Vidal against Miami. At 29, I have Chase Brown versus Pittsburgh, and Flacco seemed to find his rhythm, throwing it down the field, not really checking it down to Brown, so not expecting much upside for Chase. He has a 7-point floor in 4 of his last 5 games, so you won't get completely burned, but he has also not gone over 9 points since Joe Burrow was the quarterback in week 1. It just feels like there is never any upside, and until Burrow comes back, it is so hard to trust Chase Brown to find the end zone. So this is not an upgrade of a matchup. It's pretty average. I wouldn't be shocked if, even if you do get a touchdown, Chase Brown doesn't go over 10 points. But not expecting a touchdown, I'd be pretty surprised if that happened. At 30, I think Woody Marks is a safer play than Nick Chubb this week at Seattle. The Seahawks matchup is actually really difficult at stopping the run. They allow only 66 rushing yards per game on the season. However, they are pretty vulnerable in the passing game. They allow top 5 receiving yard production to opposing running backs. And if you look at this backfield, Woody Marks is definitely the pass catcher. Nick Chubb does not have that skill set. So I would expect Woody to have the upside in this game. I think off the bye, there's also the potential that they get the rookie even more involved. But Chubb is not going to completely disappear, and Chubb can still vulture him on the goal line. So not projecting a touchdown. The PPR value is decent. Going to keep him afloat for at least like 6 or 7 points, but to expect 10 plus is a major liability. I would much rather bench Woody Marks, but I'd rather start him than Nick Chubb in the Texans backfield. At 31, I think Tyler Algier also has some relevant sleeper potential, but not enough to start with confidence. In my opinion, his role is very similar to Zach Charbonnet, but he's not as talented as Charbonnet, and then his RB1 is definitely less likely to get hurt. Bijan is nowhere near as injury prone as Kenneth Walker, so you don't have the same value as Charbonnet, but it's in a similar tier. And if the RB1 does go down, then you do have a top 15 running back on your hands. So more leagues should be rostering Algier. His percentage is actually much lower than I would have expected. Yesterday, before waivers ran, it was at like 35% on ESPN. And especially in games when they're leading, his role is pretty locked in. In the fourth quarter, they do hand it to him a lot to close out the game. So he's averaging 11.2 touches per game for 39 yards per game. He's not hyper efficient, but he also has 3 touchdowns in 5 games. If he finds the end zone, I wouldn't be that surprised. The Niners are a top 10 matchup. So realistically speaking, I think just like Charbonnet, you do have access to about 10 or 12 points if that touchdown does hit. If it doesn't, though, you're kind of fucked, and that's where I'm probably not starting him. But at 31, I do think in this matchup, you could argue Algier is just as valuable as Charbonnet this week. A 50-yard game and a touchdown is not unrealistic to expect from Algier. At 32 and 33, the last players in this tier, I'm going to be benching both Titans running backs this week. I do have Tyjae Spears, though, ranked 1 spot above Tony Pollard. Last week, the touch split was relatively even. Pollard had 10 carries and 2 catches. Meanwhile, Tyjae Spears had 5 carries and 4 catches. So 12-9, it's starting to get much more even, and Tyjae is only 2 weeks removed from the injury list. So he is getting healthier. I think his role will expand, and entering the year, I did consider Tyjae as a potentially more valuable running back in Tennessee than Pollard, who is 28 years old. So as the season goes on, wouldn't be shocked at all if Tyjae is the more valuable guy. And this week, the matchup against New England does rank bottom 10. So not expecting a lot of points for either player, not expecting a touchdown for either guy. But given they just fired their head coach, anything is possible, especially if Ridley is out. There are limited options for the ball to go to. So I could see them lean on the run to dominate time of possession. That's kind of their only chance to keep this game close against New England. And there is wind and rain factoring in. Perhaps the weather really benefits them in terms of game script, but I don't see much of a ceiling. Without a touchdown, you're going to get burned, and it's very unlikely to hit in the first place against the Patriots. They have a very good run defense this year. So if not for the PPR value, I would rank Pollard higher. I still expect slightly more production from him, but with more catches going in favor of Tyjae, that is the tiebreaker, and that's where in PPR or half PPR settings, I would rather go Spears than Pollard. Rest of season, don't be surprised if Tyjae has more value. I could see Pollard go down. He is 28 years old after all, and hasn't looked amazing, not very efficient in the opportunity he's seen this season. So I would roster Tyjae. His percentage is also much lower than I would have thought. He will have top 40 value rest of season, and in good matchups, he does have upside to crack the top 25. So worth a roster spot, but probably a bench stash this week. Not excited to start either Titans running back against a good Patriots defense. At 34, we're dropping down a tier significantly, and at this point, I'm definitely benching players, but there is an argument that the Bengals matchup is just so good that even the backup running back for Pittsburgh does have starting value, and Kenny Gainwell did earn significantly more usage. Last week, he had 6 receptions for the second week in a row, so that does limit Jaylen Warren's value, but Kenny Gainwell still not enough to start. I am a little worried about Caleb Johnson factoring in, but against the Browns, it was a less competitive game than I'm expecting on Thursday night against the Bengals. So I would still bench Gainwell, but he has very high contingent upside if Warren were to get hurt. And we have seen him produce high efficiency back in that Dublin game, week 4. He was great. So definitely worth a roster spot. The matchup's a big upgrade, so maybe you're so desperate you'll consider a running back outside the top 30. But at 34, I'm still going to keep him on the bench. The matchup is great, though. There is possibly a touchdown incoming for Gainwell. He did have 6 catches in back-to-back games. It's possible it happens again. At 35, I have Isiah Pacheco versus Las Vegas, and Pacheco started to pull away from Hunt in the touch split last week, but Hunt still has 3 touchdowns. Pacheco only has 1. I still think Hunt is their goal line running back. So the backfield in Kansas City is not safe enough to trust. It's starting to favor Pacheco, but not in terms of actually putting up good fantasy points. Even though the Raiders have given up touchdowns this year, they do limit opposing backfields to under 100 yards per game. So not going to trust him, definitely going to bench the Chiefs backfield. I would rather have Pacheco at this point in time, though, than any other player. Up until this week, I was not quite sure who was the best guy. I think it is Pacheco. Last week, he had a lot more volume than Kareem Hunt. He's also a 7th round pick looking for his next contract. He has a lot of motivation to play well. You know he's a fighter. I think he'll step up. As the season goes on, I think he has the most upside if he can remain healthy. At 36, I have Zavier Scott versus Philadelphia, and the matchup is an upgrade overall. And if the game script gets away from running the ball with Jordan Mason, I could see a lot of targets going to Zavier Scott like they have in the past. Mason doesn't really catch passes. Zavier Scott is also fighting for a roster spot, and Aaron Jones is not returning until at least week 8, if not later. So Scott has some PPR value, but not enough to start. I would only trust Mason, but the matchup is an upgrade. I could see them offer some value here. Against Tampa, the Bucs had 131 receiving yards at the running back position in week 4 against the Eagles. It's possible there is some elite upside if this game gets away from Minnesota. But I think the Carson Wentz revenge game will be a competitive one. I think Mason is the guy you want against Philly. But Scott is in my top 40. Most of the time, that is not the case. The matchup is interesting for Zavier Scott. I also think RJ Harvey has some upside, but not enough to start. His time is coming, but it's just not here yet. Dobbins looked like shit last week. If it happens again, maybe Harvey starts to emerge a bit more, but his volume is just not high enough. The Giants matchup is starting to get more difficult. So a lot of risk with Harvey. It's not worth it if he doesn't crack the end zone. But similar to Scott, if the game script benefits passing the ball, it's possible that Harvey will emerge in the second half, but needs that passing production, not the main guy on the ground. I would still trust Dobbins. Harvey is worth rostering, but not ready to start him just yet. At 38-39, the last two starting running backs I have ranked would be Bam Knight and Michael Carter, and the backfield is too big of a rotation between them to feel good about it. In a bad matchup like this versus Green Bay, I'm definitely not trusting either guy. I don't see a touchdown for either option. The Packers only allow 93 total yards per game on 3.6 yards per carry, and only 2 touchdowns in 5 games this season. So very unlikely for any running back to find the end zone. It could go back to Bam Knight, but if you told me it pivots in favor of Carter, not going to be shocked. I do not think Carter is just going to go away. So you need volume. If it's split between the two, you'll get screwed. It's really going to be very inefficient against Green Bay. I want to bench both guys. I think you can roster them, but once Benson comes back, they have no value. In a bad matchup like this, major liabilities, major red flags. I'm saying no to Bam Knight and Michael Carter. If you roster them, keep them on the bench. At 40, last player in this tier is Jerome Ford versus Miami, who does get involved, but needs good game script. I think unless they're trailing heavy, which I'm not predicting against the Dolphins, I never trust Jerome Ford. Rough team to bet on, not many touchdowns. If they are available, they're much more likely to go to Quinshon Judkins. But Miami is a good matchup. There could be some yardage available against the Dolphins. Outside the top 40, I'm not starting any of these players, but I do rank them for the sake of your roster. If they're on the waiver wire, I would consider picking them up just for the sake of depth. They do have some value. And in this top 5 tier, I do think there is some usage this week for Kendre Miller, Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt, and Brashard Smith, and Isaiah Davis, but I'm not going to trust them in the lineup. The time will come for Kendre, but until Kamara goes down, it's just not quite here yet. Not going to trust him in the lineup. Needs a touchdown. It probably doesn't happen. For Nick Chubb, it's the same situation. Seattle is a nightmare matchup on the ground. If you don't catch passes, you have no value against Seattle. So no chance I'm starting Chubb over Woody Marks this week. A very bad start off the bye. And then 43-44, the Chiefs backfield is a big rotation. I think I'd rather have Pacheco, but Kareem Hunt is still getting most of the goal line work, so perhaps you'd rather go with him, but I just dropped him for Sterling Shepard in the Blunt League, a team I have Egbuka on. I'd rather have Shepard than Kareem Hunt. And sooner or later, Brashard Smith will be the guy you need, but for now, he's only catching like 3 receptions a game, only good for like 6 points in full PPR formats, and that is unusable. You don't have to roster either of these backup Chiefs running backs. Not going to start him, that's for sure. 45, Isaiah Davis might get some looks with Garrett Wilson probably inactive a bit more than usual, but not going to start him for sure. And then I would consider rostering Kyle Monangai for the sake of contingent upside if Swift goes down. That is a good offense, so perhaps Monangai has handcuff appeal. And same with Jeremy McNichols. There have been injuries in Washington, but until JCM goes down, you can't start McNichols. I also can't start Blake Corum, strictly handcuff appeal. He has a bye next week, so you could drop him if you wanted to. And the same thing applies with Bishal Tutin. Without a vulture touchdown, you get nothing. Also a bye in week 8, so you could drop him if you need the space. And then lastly, Tyrone Tracy only has contingent value if Skattebo gets injured. So those are my rankings this week at running back, all 50, but on the screen you're seeing the top 40. And the top 3 are going to crush this week. I would expect over 20 points from all of them, if not 1 touchdown, perhaps 2, and maybe 130 plus yards from scrimmage from them. 4 through 9, some of them have bad matchups like CMC and Achane, but you got to trust them. They have so much value in their respective offenses. They are always must starts. And then I'm worried about the matchup for Kyren and Rachaad and Cam Skattebo, but not enough to downgrade them. Still in the top 15. They are locks in the lineup. And Judkins, I do believe, will pop off in an elite matchup against Miami. He should have well over 100 yards. Swift looked amazing last week, so I think he's earned top 15 status right now. I would start Swift with confidence. In the top 20, I'm still probably going to start JCM, Jaylen Warren, and Jordan Mason with confidence. They have very good matchups, and I think the game script will really benefit them. I would expect a touchdown from all three, but Dobbins and Montgomery are pretty touchdown game script dependent. I think it'll work out. I think they're safe floor plays, not going to bust, but maybe have some capped upside. They feel like a bit more like flex plays, but in the top 20, you'll probably keep them in the lineup. And then Vidal, this is a prove-it game. The matchup was so good against Miami, it's much more difficult against the Colts. He's not a lock in the lineup, but is top 20 based on volume. He had 75% of the touches last week for LA. So the volume will carry you beyond the top 20, though. I'm not dying to start anyone. I think there's actually a lot of risk with flex plays like Genty, Etienne, and Breece Hall, some major downgrades in their respective matchups. They need touchdowns, and it's probably not going to happen. So I could be ranking them like 10 spots too high. I could see major bust games from Genty, Etienne, and Breece Hall. But Kamara on paper gets an upgrade, but I don't fully trust him. He's in the flex conversation as well. And then the last guys I would be considering would be the Seahawks backfield with Charbonnet and Walker, but I think Charbonnet is more likely for a touchdown. And then sadly, beyond the start consideration, if you are super desperate, then start a Patriots running back. The matchup is amazing, but to trust them actually working out is such a liability. It feels wasted on them. But Rhamondre and TreVeyon do have really high upside if they can find the end zone. But Chase Brown has been so uninspiring. I'm not going to start him either. Woody Marks needs some pass catching reps. The Seahawks are a tough matchup. I think off the bye could get the job over Chubb. And then Algier has a good matchup, could find the end zone, but needs late game production, which probably happens, but not at a safe enough bet to force into the lineup. He's similar to Charbonnet, though, top 35 for sure. Tajay and Tony Pollard have a rough matchup, and they're kind of in a 50-50 split, so probably going to avoid them if I can, but I do like Tajay a little bit more than Pollard this week. Outside the top 33, though, definitely benching them. There is some roster value, but really tough matchups for guys like Bam Knight and Michael Carter. They're starting running backs, but I would bench them. And then backups like Gainwell, Pacheco, Zavier Scott, RJ Harvey, and Jerome Ford. Not safe enough, but could find the end zone, could pop for 10 plus points. Without it, though, you will get screwed. Not safe enough to trust. That's it for me. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content. I'll see you next time with wide receiver ranks. My name's Adam Riancho, and thank you for watching. Nice and blunt.